Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. The topic for today's show is the return of the wolf, the myth, the politics, and the animal itself. Do you remember this? "Oh, grandmother, what big ears you have. The better to hear you with, my child," was the reply. "But grandmother, what big eyes you have. The better to see you with, my dear." "But grandmother, what large hands you have. The better to hug you with." "Oh, but grandmother, what a terrible big mouth you have. The better to eat you with," said the wolf, the big bad wolf. In the hour that follows, we'll hear the story of the wolf, a story that includes ignorance, enlightenment, and rebuilding. The story is one of politics, law, and the courage of a few. Those few include Nina Facione, a nationally recognized expert on wildlife conservation, and a VP for species conservation at Defenders of Wildlife. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming, Nina.
Thank you.
Congratulations on everything that you've accomplished. Also with us is Jan Holder, a cattle rancher from Arizona. She is president of a predator-friendly company that sells products in 11 western states. She is an environmentalist, an advisory board member for Defenders of Wildlife. Jan, thank you so much for coming all the way to Massachusetts. We're delighted to have you here. And David Haynes is an animal rights activist, a law student at the Massachusetts School of Law, and a producer for today's show. David, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm Diane Sullivan, your host for today's program. David, let's begin with you. Why does a law student sitting here in Massachusetts care so much about the wolves of the West?
I had the opportunity to grow up out west, and had the fortune of spending a fair amount of time in the wilderness out there. And the vast wilderness of the West is it's a very wild landscape, and it's full of symbolism, such as the grandeur of the peaks of the Tetons or the Rocky Mountains, the cattle ranchers working their range with cows. And along this time period that I spent out there, it was obvious to me that there was something missing, and that was the wolf. And in 1872, when Yellowstone was designated our first national park, the wolf was present there. And with the expansion of man out west and the extermination of the wolf, he was no longer there. And for me, the wolf had a great deal to do with symbolism, and he was a symbol of everything that was wild. And we as man, we've annihilated these species, and whether it was incidental or consequential, it shouldn't have been allowed. And I felt that for me personally, reintroduction I saw as a correction of past environmental atrocities.
And so you want to do your part in trying to help debunk some of the myths that surround the wolf and see that the wolf stays in Yellowstone National Park.
Absolutely. And I learned as a law student through the animal law class that you teach at the school, that if you want to affect better rights for animals, or if you want to have species that were eradicated at one time reintroduced, is you have to use the legal and the political process to make that happen.
And you got to get involved.
It's the only way.
Nina, we now have the echo of the howl of wolves in Yellowstone National Park and elsewhere in our country, and due in large part to the extraordinary work of you folks at Defenders of Wildlife. And to that, again, I applaud you. Why the passion for wolves?
Well, as David indicated, people are very passionate about wolves. They represent things both symbolically but also very tangibly. Wolves play a key role in maintaining healthy environments. They're considered, therefore, a keystone species. The health of other species and our environment itself really depends on the presence of the wolf. And we've seen that very strongly and very clearly since the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. But people also feel an emotional bond with wolves, whether it's because wolf society is similar to our own human society in terms of family units, pack structure, or whether it's because they were our first domesticated animal. Our relationship with wolves goes back a long way. But I think ultimately the bottom line is that many people feel a need to restore this imbalance, something that was destroyed by human actions, at human hands, and restore a pristine, as much as it can be, wilderness for our children and our children's children.
And I do want to talk in a few minutes about the elimination or near elimination of the wolf from our culture. Before we do, Jan, you have to tell me, I thought a cattle rancher was an enemy of the wolf. Why are you wolf friendly?
Well, that's a good question. I agree with Nina that people are very passionate about the wolf, but sometimes they're passionate against the wolf. Where we ranch, which is in Arizona, it's in the wolf reintroduction zone. When the wolf reintroduction was first proposed, there was a huge outcry against the reintroduction by the local ranchers. As a family, though, it really had a real deep meaning for us because my husband's grandfather, Eugene Cleveland Holder, was credited for killing the last wolf in the state of Arizona. He worked for a state agency and there was a bounty on wolves, and they felt that to be able to produce more cattle that we had to get rid of the wolf. And so as a family, we really wanted to take a look at really what, what it would mean to us as a family, but also what it would mean to the environment, what it would really mean to the land. And so we tried to look at it openly and with an open mind and tried to see, if we could live with the wolf. And I guess the reason that we felt that, that we could live with it is because that we think it's going to be an asset on the land. We've seen that already in some other areas, and we think we're going to see that in Arizona, that the land's going to be healthier. And as cattle ranchers, a healthier land means a more productive land. And so we really feel that not just from an environmental standpoint and a wildlife standpoint, that we also feel from a cattle ranching standpoint, it's actually an asset.
Well, isn't that interesting? That certainly was not the answer that I expected to hear, and I'm glad to hear it. Panel, let's go back in time to 500 BC. Let's talk about the fables. You heard me read from Little Red Riding Hood. There was also Three Little Pigs and all the fairy tale literature that really portrayed the wolf as this wild, long-fanged killer. Is that an accurate description of the wolf?
It's not an accurate description of the wolf, although it's certainly true that the wolf is a predator, a carnivore. They do eat meat, and yet they have been very unfairly portrayed in all the literature from Aesop's fables on, the ones you mentioned. But it's probably worth pointing out that very early cultures had a very high level of respect for the wolf. And in fact, Native American cultures, early European cultures, in Japan, some early cultures really almost revered the wolf. The wolf was a fertility symbol, particularly for crops. In Native American cultures, it was brother wolf. And so there was actually a time when we coexisted with wolves and had positive images of them before all these negative images and portrayals kicked in.
So what happened within our community to make us all of a sudden see the wolf as this evil creature?
Well, I think two things. First, as we stopped living essentially as wolves did, being hunters and gatherers, and turned to pastoralism, then that really turned the wolf from being a friend into being an enemy. As we started raising livestock, the wolf really did become a problem, particularly as we started eliminating their natural prey. Human societies ran into more and more conflicts with wolves. But also with the rise of Christianity, the wolf became a symbol of negative things, those primitive cultures and primitive religions. And so the wolf was kind of a symbol of the devil and things that were not Christian.
Wow.
One thing I've heard just recently, Nina, that I thought was interesting was some of the Apache tribes have told me that the wolf became a symbol to them of the Walk of Tears. Because during the walk, when the Indians were moved onto reservations and they were forced to walk long distances, they would be able to hear the howl of the wolves in the distance. And that became a symbol to them of their lost culture and of being alone and afraid and thinking that they were headed off to destruction. And that's something I've heard just recently that I think also kind of holds a lot of big feelings for the people that are out there dealing with the wolf today.
All right, a question that I think we should ask, to which I don't know the answer, I hope I can guess what the answer might be, is how many human beings in the United States, in North America, have been killed by wolves?
Well, the statistic is that there's not a case of a human being being killed in currently the United States by a healthy wild wolf. And you'll notice that there are some caveats in there. There are cases of rabid wolves, wolves with rabies, attacking and killing humans. But it's important to keep perspective. I mean, it's more dangerous to get in your car every day or get in an airplane, or frankly, there are statistics you're more likely to be killed by a falling vending machine in our country than you are to be killed by a wolf. So again, they're wild animals. We need to all maintain respect for wild animals, not feed them, maintain our distance, and all of those sort of common sense things. But the reality is that wolves do not generally pose a threat to humans out in nature.
So where we are so far is we have cattle ranchers for economic reasons wanting to see the wolf eliminated. We have religious communities fueling, I'll call it wolf hysteria, if you will. What other factors contributed to the myth surrounding the wolf as this evil, vicious creature? Anything else, or was this principally the reasons?
Well, I'll tell you one that's pretty recent, and that is I think the wolf has almost become a symbol to a lot of people that are on the ground, a lot of cattle ranchers and some farmers. It's a symbol of their way of life disappearing. Right now, there are so many different factors that are contributing to the loss of people on the land. You know, there's the economic factors. The commodity beef market has been slowly going down, you know, over many decades. But you also have increased governmental pressures to do things they've never done before, you know, monitor on the land. There's also a lot of environmental pressures that are going on. There's, you know, lawsuits on the land for a multitude of reasons. And then, of course, in the middle of the whole thing, they put the wolf. So the wolf has become kind of a symbol for everything that's going wrong with their life. It's become a symbol of loss of control for them.
As we hear ranchers tell us all the time, the wolf is the straw that broke the camel's back. We already were dealing with disease and other predation and so on, and now you give us the wolf, and so this is a challenge.
Okay, let's stay with history for just a moment. But David, you wanted to interject?
Along with Nina and Jan's comment, it you know, as Western civilization moved west from the east and eradicated so many things. Buffalo, we had 60 million buffalo at one time on the Great Plains, and by the late 1800s, they were reduced to less than 300s, and what was done to the Native American Indian. And I think it comports back to what Nina was saying, that it seems to be the whole issue with the wolf out west particularly is control. And I think that a lot of people feel they're losing control. And as Jan said, it's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak.
Well, let's talk about, in our history, the expansion west. Tell us a little bit about the number of wolves that were in the United States, where they were located, the different types of wolves. Nina?
There's actually a current debate, as there always is among the scientific community, about some of those questions. But the general estimate is that there were probably 400,000 red and gray wolves in North America at the time of European settlement. There are two species of wolves in the world: red wolves, Canis rufus, and gray wolves, Canis lupus. All the other terms you hear for wolf, timber wolf, Mexican wolf, those are all just terms for a subspecies of gray wolf that existed. And originally scientists thought there were 20 or 25 different subspecies. Now it's accepted, common thought, that there are about 5 subspecies of gray wolf in North America. But we were really starting out with at least 400,000. Current scientists say the number might have been far higher than that in North America as Europeans started moving west, settling and moving west.
And where were they principally in the country? Were they in Idaho?
Wolves were all over. In fact, they were all over the globe in just about every type of habitat that, you know, was at least bit hospitable. They were in our deserts, and they were in the Arctic, and they were in swamplands in the southeast, and they were in mountains. So they had a very wide distribution.
You know, I look at a wolf and I see an animal that doesn't look that different than my dog.
Well, your dog is a direct descendant of the wolf, and again, scientists differ on the date that this happened, but they were probably our first domesticated species, you know, thousands of years ago. And so even, yes, the Chihuahuas and the St. Bernards today are related to those red and gray wolves.
Yeah, that's really hard to believe, isn't it?
It's hard to believe. Yes.
Discuss, if you would, for me, Jan, the problems that wolves present to cattle ranching.
Well, there's the obvious problems with predation. You know, we have, you know, now with the wolf, we've got one more predator out there in the land. Most cattle ranchers are already dealing with coyotes, They're dealing with mountain lions, they're dealing with bears, and now, of course, they're also dealing with wolves in a lot of areas. So you've got that one more predator out there. You've got to watch your kids more, you've got to do a lot of that sort of thing. But also, a big thing that kind of is hard to get a handle on and a hard thing to quantify is the extra amount of work. And even people that are willing to do it, it still takes a lot more work. I know that we are around our cattle on a daily basis to make sure that there's always that human presence. We always make sure our cattle are kept together. You know, they're not allowed to stray off by themselves. And there's a lot of other things that may or may not take place. A lot of ranchers in the West are ranching on public lands, and depending on which land management agency that you are dealing with, once you leave a pasture, usually you cannot go back in it. So in other words, if you're moving your cattle to stay away from predators that are out there, and also to stay away from possible other breeding teeny species, then what you've got is you've got a lack of places to put them towards the end of the year. And that's happened to our family very frequently. And we're willing to do it because we think it's the right thing to do, but it certainly costs a lot in terms of time and in terms of money.
In the remaining few minutes before we take a break, let's discuss the wolf bounty, the Code of the West, the hysteria over wolves, the killing, slaughter, and inhumane treatment of wolves. Nina, let me begin with you.
Well, the first bounty in the United States actually started right here in Massachusetts in 1630.
Oh, how shameful.
Massachusetts led the way. But actually, frankly, wolfing, as it was known, or wolfers, as they were called, was a rather lucrative industry at a time when a cowboy's monthly salary might have been $15 or $20. You could get that much and far more through private industry for killing wolves. And so there was a lot of economic incentive to kill wolves. And of course, this was long before we had Rachel Carson telling us, you know, about healthy ecosystems and Aldo Leopold. And so really there just wasn't an understanding of the role that wolves play in maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And so honestly, in the minds of early settlers, there was probably a lot to gain from killing wolves and not a lot to gain from keeping them around.
We need to take a break, so we'll come back and hear from the two of you in just a moment. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Two words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
Don't walk. Don't walk. Walk. Do not enter. Hot dogs. Definitely like hot dogs. Motorcycle club. Everything must go. Ghostly ghouls. Don't look at that, Teddy. Body piercing. Ouch.
Everyday moments can become
got that
teaching
right,
moments
buddy.
because learning starts long before school does. Give your child the start they need at bornlearning.org.
Hey, yo, Ted, get on your job, kid. We got school, yo. I see you in the window, man. You want me to do? I got the bus here, man. I got connections. We holding up traffic. Let's go. I'm not letting you waste your life like that, yeah.
You don't have to be a hero to be a hero. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Welcome back to the Educational Forum, where we're discussing the return of the wolves. David, in your research for the show, I read a lot about the method and the manner in which wolves were brought to near extinction in the United States. Could you describe for the audience the methods that were used? It's my understanding that a gun was not used, where a bullet might have been necessary. We resorted to really extreme, gruesome measures. Am I accurate on that?
I think you're very accurate. From my research, I found that, you know, the wolf was a hated entity, and there was, they poisoned them, they tortured them, they cut their Achilles tendons, they'd sick dogs on them. I think a lot of wolves were incidentally shot, and this later evolved to aerial shooting from airplanes and helicopters. And the poisoning, I think, is probably one of the worst, with strychnine and arsenic, because then that effectuated so many incidental killings of innocent animals that were also poisoned from that.
Makes you wonder how in a civilized society this goes on, and more importantly, why. What was the thought?
Well, again, Diane, back then they just thought that they were going to make the West a better place to produce more cattle and a safer place. In Arizona, I know that they used all of the methods that David just talked about, but you know, I've seen many, many photos, even of my husband's grandfather, with hundreds of bodies of wolves next to him that were either poisoned or trapped or shot. And it was also a measure of their prowess as not just you know, as part of their job, but also as a man, that they were a great hunter, that they were able to triumph over all this evil. They're pretty dramatic photos.
And I think we were speaking earlier about, you know, the dominion of man over all living things as they moved the westward expansion. And I think a lot of it came through the, you know, periods of Christianity and directly out of Genesis, where it basically says that man should have all dominion and control over all living things. And I think a lot of people took that under some sort of a Christian doctrine that it was okay.
It was permissible.
It was permissible.
It's probably worth reemphasizing what David said about the strychnine, that while they were poisoning hundreds of thousands of wolves, there were literally millions of other animals, other species that were poisoned at the same time. The coyotes, the foxes, the birds of prey, a whole host of species. So it really wasn't just the elimination of this one species, but altering the landscape, you know, in a tremendous way through this poisoning.
Never have heard about this, Nina.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's actually, in hindsight's 2020, obviously, but it's a little frightening to think that we could do this and not see at the time all the harmful ramifications.
And not really reported. It's not a part of our history books, that I know, or maybe it is today, but I don't think so. We kind of sweep it under the carpet because it's so horrendous. All right, so at what point are the wolves nearing extinction?
Well, certainly by the early part of the 1900s, by the 1930s and 40s, they were eliminated from just about everywhere throughout the lower 48 states, except for a stronghold remaining in Minnesota. And in fact, that was the last remaining population of wolves. At the time, wolves were listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act.
Where was public opinion at this time?
Well, luckily the 70s were a time of great change and enlightenment in many ways, and again with Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, talking about just various harms that we've done to the environment and just the environmental movement together, Richard Nixon passing the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act, and some really key pieces of legislation to protect our land and our wildlife. So public sentiment at that time was very much in favor of trying to correct previous wrongs. The wolf was one of the first species listed under the Endangered Species Act. In fact, it was listed under a precursor to the act in the 60s, and then right after the act was passed, the wolf was one of the first animals placed under those protections.
For the audience, let's talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act. What does it mean? How is an animal placed on the act, and is it a significant accomplishment? And then we can talk more specifically about the wolf.
Well, it's a very ripe topic for conversation today, because currently the Endangered Species Act is under threat in Congress. The act is old. It was passed in the early 70s, and so like anything that gets old, it maybe needs a tune-up. But unfortunately, what is happening in Congress, Congressman Richard Pombo from California has proposed sweeping changes to the Endangered Species Act that would really threaten all of the plants and animals that have been protected to date. some of the criticisms of the act are that it doesn't recover species quickly enough or enough species, but really out of the 1,800 species that have been placed under the protections of the Endangered Species Act, only a few have gone extinct, only a handful have gone extinct, and so really they're gauging it by the wrong yardstick. The Endangered Species Act, the purpose of this act was to prevent extinction, and that it has done remarkably well. Wolves, grizzly bears, black-footed ferrets, California condors, I mean, a host of species that are recovering now or that we have around thanks to this piece of legislation.
What does it mean if an animal is placed on the Endangered Species Act?
It means that the United States government needs to create recovery plans and needs to actively take steps to protect the species, whether it's plant or animal, take steps to protect it, and in the case of many species, develop a recovery plan, reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, protections of grizzly bears in Yellowstone in the West.
Does it also mean that a citizen cannot hunt an animal that's on the list?
There are absolutely protections for threatened and endangered species under the list that vary by species and by region, and there are some restrictions on habitat for the species that it's different. It varies with each species that's listed.
So in 1975, the wolf is placed on the Endangered Species Act.
73, a little earlier, yep.
It was 1973. Okay, so the wolf was placed on the act. At that point, there are wolves in only 2 states.
There was a healthy population of wolves only in Minnesota, really just one state, where there were fewer than 1,000 wolves.
Take us from there to Yellowstone National Park and the project.
Well, because they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to develop a recovery plan for the gray wolf, and part of that was a Northern Rockies recovery plan that proposed reintroducing wolves back into the Yellowstone ecosystem and into central Idaho. Now, because of lawsuits and other things that held it up, it took 20 years to do so. I mean, the recovery plan came out in the mid-'70s, and the first reintroduction of wolves took place in 1995, a decade ago. This is actually the 10th year anniversary of wolf reintroduction. So it was a long and challenging process because of politics, not because of biology.
Tell us about some of the politics.
Well, Dan might want to address some of the politics. I mean, it really were concerns and lawsuits from the ranching community, the American Farm Bureau Federation.
And I bet you the loggers were in there too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, tell us about that, Jan.
Well, I really don't know a lot about the specifics, but I do know that there was a strong outcry against bringing the wolves back, and I think that every group, from the cattle growers to the Farm Bureau, I think that they really tried to take a look at how they could stop it, because they felt that it would really make them lose control.
And were you initially successful as a group of cattle ranchers in stopping some of the regrowth efforts with respect to the wolf?
Well, we were never against the reintroduction of the wolf. Arizona is still one of those places, it's still the wilds. And at first, even in 1973, when it was put on the endangered species list, Arizona just tried to be quiet and tried to stay there in the corner and hope nobody knew that we were still there. So the effects of that act really didn't hit until the 90s, until it started happening in Yellowstone, when it started being obvious that might happen in Arizona. So we were a little late coming on board with with any kind of opposition because of that reason.
I think the opposition by the ranching community industry really, first of all, clearly stalled it by several decades. But it also had one beneficial aspect, and that is that the concerns of locals and of ranchers were addressed through the reintroduction process, so that the wolves that were reintroduced into Yellowstone in central Idaho were reintroduced under a special designation under the Endangered Species Act called an experimental non-essential designation. It provides more flexibility in managing wolves than if they had a purely endangered status. And so this was really to accommodate the concerns of the livestock industry, and it enabled things such as if wolves were repeatedly preying on livestock, federal agents could move those wolves or lethally control them if necessary. So it's important to differentiate between some concerns that maybe were not so real, concerns of people's children being harmed by wolves, which we've already said is very unlikely and certainly hasn't happened since wolves were introduced, and the legitimate concerns that it is hard for a rancher to make a living on the landscape and that wolves would just be one additional challenge for them to deal with. Well, the designation of experimental non-essential helped smooth the way.
Tell us how the wolves were reintroduced. Did you have a number living in captivity that were bred, and how did that all happen?
The reintroductions were actually translocations of wild wolves from Canada. So the Canadian authorities worked with the US authorities in terms of identifying wolves, and they did two separate things. In Yellowstone, they did what was called a soft release, where they captured family units or packs of wolves up in Canada and placed them in very large enclosures in Yellowstone to help them get acclimated to the area. I mean, bear in mind that this really had never been done before. Nobody knew what would happen. Everybody was convinced the wolves would make a beeline right back to Canada or right to the nearest ranch and start, chowing down on cattle. And so they thought maybe if they could acclimate the wolves to Yellowstone, they would do that. And they captured wolves, put them in enclosures, and let them stay there for a period of time. Whereas in Idaho, they did what was called a hard release, where they captured younger individual animals, mostly juvenile animals, and just let them go right out of the cages into Idaho. And the good news is that it worked quite well in both cases. The Idaho wolves did start to range a little bit farther north, but then eventually settled, or in some cases even turned around and came back south and settled. I mean, after 60 years without a large predator in Yellowstone, there were so many elk and other prey items for the wolves to eat. Why go anywhere else? It was a smorgasbord in Yellowstone.
And the animals, the wolves, are doing well in Idaho still today?
The wolves are doing fabulously beyond anybody's expectations. They reintroduced 66 animals into those two locations over 2 years, in 95 and 96, and now 10 years later there are 800 to 900 wolves in that area. It's really, we call it one of our greatest conservation success stories in the last century. It's really remarkable.
Now, there are some people out in the audience that are saying, oh no, then 10 years from now we're going to have 1 million.
Well, we are seeing that wolf populations are stabilizing. Again, there was no competition, and there was a whole lot of prey. There's a whole lot of food. And so we're seeing wolf populations stabilizing in Yellowstone and even the growth rate stabilizing. And so I don't actually think that's a concern, that the population will grow exponentially.
Jan, tell us a little bit about how society benefits from a wolf population.
Well, I know that they're seeing, up in Yellowstone, they're seeing the riparian areas really come back, which I think is just remarkable that that's happening already. But the way I see it is that I also see it as really even benefiting cattle ranchers because of the fact that you're going to be keeping your herds closer together so that they're not preyed upon. And that's healthier for grass. That's healthier so that the cattle aren't tromping the riparian areas, so that they're not allowed to sit and bite the grass down to the bare ground. There's been a lot of movement in the past couple of decades towards a more holistic way of ranching, really to be able to look at the land and not just look at the cattle. Not how fat the cattle are, it's how high your grass is. And that'll tell you how healthy the land is. And I can see that a good predator base really adds to that, because again, the riparian areas become healthier, your grasslands get healthier. And I also see it as really helping ranchers become even better stewards of the land, because they learn to stay with their cattle more so they know what's going on, and they're producing healthier food.
Is it a present problem that occasionally a rancher will wake up and a cattle has been destroyed by a wolf? And if so, what do you do about it?
Well, we have had some depredation in Arizona, and I really believe that as we go on, that cattle ranchers will get better at spending more time with their cattle, being able to look at those signs for when predators are out there. There's certainly been times that our family, we've actually had to camp out with the cattle when we knew the wolves were in the area. And what happens is we make enough noise, and our scent and our presence is enough to just make them move on. That a bunny is going to be a lot easier than one of our calves, to have for dinner that night. But I really see it as over time that the people are going to learn how to work with it.
You then don't see the wolf as a threat if you're out there sleeping with the cattle.
Well, of course they're a threat.
To you personally.
Well, the thing, I wouldn't allow a small child to go wandering around loose, but then again, there's also mountain lions out there, and I don't allow my children who are still young to ever venture away alone without the dogs and me and, us with them. So it's a wild animal, it's a predator, and we have a lot of respect for that. But again, if you're intelligent and understand what a wolf's nature is, you're not going to make those mistakes, and you're going to learn how to keep your cattle safe along with your kids.
So you have learned to coexist with the wolf.
Yes, we've learned to coexist with the wolf. We're happy to say we haven't had any predator loss, either from a wolf or a mountain lion or anything whatsoever, for almost 10 years now on our ranch.
You are one cattle rancher, and many people in the audience probably say you're an exception to the rule. How is it that other cattle ranchers throughout the West have gone along with this?
How have they gone along with it? Well, for one thing, I think that, there are exceptions. There's ranches where it's really hard to, find your cattle, much less be able to, know where the wolves are. But not only, have they learned that once you learn what the wolves are all about, you can learn to deal with it. But the other thing that we've done is we actually are using that as a tool to sell our product, to sell our beef. Because we found more and more people want wolves on the land. They want more abundant wildlife. And we charge a premium for that, for the extra work that we do and the extra work that the other people that we buy from do. And so it actually helps the bottom line.
Okay, and that's in your case, but for the cattle ranching industry at large, Nina, how have you worked this all out?
Well, Defenders of Wildlife manages a program called the Bailey Wildlife Foundation Wolf Compensation Trust, where we reimburse ranchers for verified livestock losses to wolves. And so it doesn't, it takes the sting out if it doesn't make up for the fact that they have to do the extra work and replace the livestock, but it certainly takes the sting out of losing livestock to wolves. We paid full market value for livestock that U.S. agents determine were killed by wolves, and we try to do it quickly so that they're not waiting for payments. And it also helps us build relationships with ranchers so that we can talk to them about perhaps changing husbandry practices or taking steps to prevent depredations in the future.
Right, and I'm sure that was a necessary tool in trying to alleviate some of the opposition of the cattle ranchers.
Well, one thing Defenders did that I think was really important is they established a livestock advisory board and asked some livestock producers in the West to be on the board. And that's helped not only for us to be able to make Defenders understand what the true cost is, because I think it's all very well and good to have Defenders say we're going to do this, but they may have one idea of what an animal's worth, and we may have another, either for a guard dog or for a calf or a steer. But it's also really helped us to feel like Defenders is really responding to us, that our concerns as people on the land are really taken into consideration in their work. And I think that's had a really positive impact long term.
What are the present concerns, if any, of the ranchers with respect to the wolves in your community?
Well, the biggest one is just that we're going to be overrun by wolves. It's a big concern. As the rancher keeps getting squeezed year after year after year, and most people don't understand that what they consider a good living is not what most cattle ranchers live on. Most of them are living this close to complete poverty, and so an extra few $1,000s a year that is now they're getting reimbursed for that from Defenders. That can mean the difference between their kids having shoes that year. It's a big deal, and so it's really if the wolves are going to take over, and they will be gone, and it's not just a loss of their job. It's a loss of their livelihood. It's a loss of their homes. It's a loss of their history. And it's not like they can go someplace and get a job, at Walmart and come back, in a couple of years when things are better. Their ranches are gone. They don't. There's no way for them to get back on the land again. And there's no other jobs out there like that for them. So their way of life is gone.
Jan, thanks for those comments. We need to take a second break, so please stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
go to jail for a gun crime, and your family serves a sentence with you.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It just rented.
My name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street.
It's not available.
I use a wheelchair and...
It's gone.
Hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim, call us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll put that out.
Welcome back to the Educational Forum, where we're talking about wolves. Jan and Nina, tell us about solutions and about new projects and programs Defenders is working on.
Well, Defenders started an even more recent program than our compensation program called our Proactive Fund, where we will cost share with ranchers to take steps to prevent wolves and, frankly, grizzly bears from having the opportunity to prey on livestock. And so we will work with ranchers who come up, any kind of innovative technological solution they can think of, that sounds reasonable, we'll help them pay for. So that might be buying livestock guardian dogs, paying for some of the labor and the manpower that Jan mentioned in the form of range riders to protect herds, paying for electric fencing, and a whole host of other technologies that can kind of prevent depredations from happening. Our compensation trust is great, but it is kind of like closing the barn door after the cow gets out. So this is proactive, and it prevents problems, and it prevents heartaches. And again, it's been a great way for us to work with ranchers and understand their needs and their concerns.
You talk about new technologies, but whatever happened to the old fence? Doesn't that do the job?
Well, some of the ranches out west are extremely large. The cattle range over enormous tracts of land, and so that is, frankly, one of the problems in that cattle range over such large tracts of land that ranchers don't necessarily always have a good idea of where they are and so on.
Mm-hmm. And when you think of a fence, too, that may be an effective tool for keeping cattle in a certain area, but it's certainly not going to keep a wolf in a certain area. So, you may actually be causing more harm by having cattle fenced in an area, because then they're a captive audience for the wolf.
And so the wolf can jump over any fence.
Or go under.
Well, one of our new technologies, which is actually quite an old technology, is called fladry. And it was an ancient European technique for actually corralling wolves in order to kill them. And we put a new world, modern day spin on it, and we use it to keep wolves away from cattle. And the interesting thing is, it's not any sort of an actual physical barrier. It's just it's flagging like you would see at a used car lot. It's literally plastic triangular flags hanging down off a rope that, for whatever reasons, wolves do not like, and they won't cross it. Coyotes and other animals don't have a problem. They'll sit back and forth underneath, but wolves are intimidated by it. And so that's been very successful when there's a small enough property, a small enough area that you need to keep wolves out of for a temporary period.
One of the reasons why I think all of these proactive techniques are so important, not only does it help keep the wolves from getting to the cattle to begin with, which I think is very important, but it also is a tool to help people learn about how to work with wolves. And I've always felt that was the missing part in all of these reintroductions, is the educational process. Mm-hmm. Basically what they've done is they've decided to reintroduce an animal that people don't know how to deal with anymore. They don't know what it's going to do, they don't know how it's going to react, they don't know how to protect themselves, they just don't know what to do. too. And that's what this is really doing. It's really teaching people how to live with an animal that hasn't been there for a long time.
Well, tell us a little bit about the wolf itself. I mean, what does a wolf eat? How big are they? How long do they live?
How long they
David.
live, I'm really not sure.
Life is rough for a wolf in the
It's
wild.
very rough, and I think it all comes back to the balance of a healthy ecosystem. And if the sustainable populations of game for the wolves, I think they'll live and prosper well. And I think that's shown just by the vast numbers that have reproduced and are now living in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, Montana and Wyoming, just from the original 15 that were soft released and then the hard release that one time. We made the comment earlier about wolves and eating cattle. In the literature, there's even times where wolves had wandered outside of Yellowstone Park after the reintroduction, and they were living in pastures full of cattle and raising pups. And I think inherently wolves really don't like humans. They don't like being around them. And in the first enclosure pen they had for the first soft release, when they finally opened the door to let the wolves out, they wouldn't leave the pen. And they think it was because of the scent of the humans dragging roadkill in and feed for those wolves for, I think they were in the pen 10 weeks, was it, acclimation, that they finally had to cut a hole in the side of the fence where the humans hadn't been, and then the wolves finally left. So my feeling and understanding is that wolves would really like to stay as far away from humans as they can.
You know what, David raises a good point that also ties into what Jan just said, and that is that that people need to learn to live with wolves. And when I've spoken to ranchers in Canada and Alberta and places where they have lived with wolves for a longer period, they'll tell me, oh, I have a wolf pack now, but that's a good wolf pack. You know, that wolf pack doesn't prey on livestock, so I'm leaving them be. If I get rid of that wolf pack, we might have another pack that moves in that does prey on livestock. And so wolves generally prefer wild prey and don't like human scents and will avoid humans, but you do certainly have the individual wolf that's more bold or for whatever reason will prey on livestock. And so part of our learning process might be figuring out how to keep wolves away and then learning to live with the ones that aren't bothering us.
As a cattle rancher, that's something we see all the time. We would always joke whenever we would start to see, bobcats, mountain lions, a bear, whatever around our house, somebody in the community somewhere has killed a mountain lion or has killed something because it totally upsets the prey balance. And that's why we would always say we wish they would learn to leave them alone so they could establish their territories. Because, once you know where they're at, they kind of get used to you, they get used to your patterns, and you get used to where they're going to be so that you can deal with keeping your animals safe, your cattle safe a whole lot better.
So it is easy to coexist.
I wouldn't say it's easy. I think it's worthwhile.
It's worthwhile. Good point. Defenders is involved now with preventing the aerial slaughter of wolves up in Alaska, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's a very frustrating situation. This is a situation where there are probably about 1,500 wolves killed in Alaska every year, legally through hunting and trapping. And then additionally, the Alaska legislature over the years has initiated this aerial killing of wolves, either through land and shoot, where you chase a wolf pack until frankly they're exhausted and land and kill them, or shooting them directly from airplanes. And it's a practice that the American public for sure and the majority of Alaskans find reprehensible. They consider that it's not fair chase. It's not based on any sound biological management principles of wildlife populations. It's really done solely to artificially inflate moose and caribou populations for the sake of hunters, many of whom are out of state, not even Alaska native hunters. And so twice, the Alaska voters have voted during ballot initiatives to end this practice, the first time in 1996 and again in 2000. Unfortunately, in Alaska, the legislature can overturn a ballot initiative after waiting a period of time, which is why in 96, Alaska voters voted overwhelmingly to ban this form of wolf killing. In 99, the legislature overturned that. In 2000, Alaskans once again voted to end this practice, and in 2003, the legislature overturned it again. So we're back in a period where they are killing wolves from airplanes.
I sure hope you can stop that. Different topic. Let's go back in time to the mid to late 1990s. The suit that was brought to remove the wolves from Yellowstone National Park, I'd like to hear from the president of Defenders. He was kind enough to send us a package for our viewers to take a look at, so I'd ask that we watch that, and then I'll come back to you for comment.
Wolves living in the Yellowstone region are under attack, but this week they're taking their case to court. Defenders of Wildlife, the conservation group that led the effort to reintroduce the wolves into the park, will be bringing a gray wolf to the door of a federal appeals court in Denver, Colorado. It's there that a panel of judges will hear arguments in the long battle over whether the wolves, released into the park almost 5 years ago, should be removed from Yellowstone.
Defenders of Wildlife is bringing a wolf to the doorstep of the courthouse to emphasize that it is the lives of the Yellowstone wolves that are at stake in the court's decision.
Leading the attack on the wolves is the American Farm Bureau Federation, which in 1997 successfully convinced a Wyoming judge to rule that the reintroduction was illegal based on a technicality, and that all of the wolves must be eliminated from Yellowstone. With nowhere else to go, such a ruling would mean that the wolves would have to be destroyed.
The Farm Bureau wants the wolves forcibly removed from Yellowstone, which would result in their death sentence. But the American public wants the wolves to stay, and that's what Defenders is fighting for.
Conservationist Brian O'Neill, who was the lead plaintiff attorney in the Exxon Valdez case, will be representing Defenders of Wildlife and other prominent conservation groups. In a press conference after the hearing, the groups will present nearly 300,000 signed petitions demanding that the wolves be protected.
The reintroduced wolves have had families and they've prospered. They have also contributed significantly to the health of the ecology and the health of the local economy. We believe that when the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals considers both the purpose of the law and the success of the reintroduction program, that it will agree.
If the ruling is upheld, wolves living in Yellowstone today would be killed.
Nina, take us current. What happened with that case, and where do we stand today within the legal maneuvers that have been instituted against the wolf?
Well, I'm happy to say we won that case, clearly, because there are almost 900 wolves in that region today. But you're right that the legal wranglings continue. Wolves have done so well under the reintroduction program that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed 2 years ago to remove federal protections from wolves throughout our country. And while Defenders certainly applauds the restoration to date in the Great Lakes states and in the Northern Rockies, we feel that the job isn't finished yet. And Defenders led a coalition, Defenders and 18 other plaintiffs, to stop what we consider the premature removal of federal protections for wolves. Just this past January, we won that case as well. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to go back to the drawing board and figure out, all right, maybe wolves are recovering in some areas, the Great Lakes states, the Northern Rockies, but we still have areas that don't have wolves, that scientists have determined have suitable wolf habitat, the Northeast United States, Colorado, the Pacific Northwest, that we really need to look at in terms of restoring the wolf. As Roger said in that clip, wolves have been beneficial not just for the environment and the health of the ecosystem, but economically as well, bringing in tourist dollars everywhere that they exist. So I think that there are a lot of reasons to keep looking at other potential wolf restoration sites.
Well, you brought up something that I have to talk about. A couple of years ago, it was February, it was a freezing cold Sunday morning, and I was out walking my dogs very, very early. And as I rounded back out of the woods onto our street, which is a fairly busy street, I looked ahead and initially thought what I saw was a beautiful Siberian Husky or German Shepherd. And I stopped, and the animal turned and looked at me. And I knew that this was not a dog. And so I stopped. And it looked at me and it ran. And it ran in such a way I've never saw anything more magnificent in my life. And I came home and I said, I've just seen a wolf. And I really think that family, friends, and colleagues, as I continued to tell the story, they really wanted to have me committed because they said, Diane, there are no wolves in Massachusetts. And I said, I know what I saw, and I did research. David, tell me about the Eastern Coyote.
You probably saw an Eastern Coyote. And the coyotes have been ubiquitous to all the lower 48 states, well, every state in the Union with the exception of Hawaii. And as farmlands were expanding out there and less habitat for coyotes, they seem to have moved eastward and even colonized more. And they think that the Eastern Coyote might even actually be a hybrid cross between the typical coyote and the red wolf and Canis rufus. And
people think that I'm making this up, and I know that I'm not, because my dogs are very large dogs. They're 109 pounds, and nearly 100 is the other one. This dog that I saw, this coyote, this wolf as I call it, had to be 130 pounds minimum. Are coyotes that big?
Generally they range about between 30 and 50 pounds, but I think in the wintertime they probably had a winter coat and they looked a lot bigger than he actually was. But maybe you got lucky and actually saw a wolf.
We get calls like this frequently, and David's right that the Eastern Coyote is larger than the Western Coyote, but it's no 130 pounds. Nonetheless, there are other possible explanations. People sometimes have wolves or wolf hybrids as pets. Perhaps you saw an escaped animal, or with the winter coat animals. I see red fox all the time where I horseback ride, and they look huge, and I know it's just a healthy winter coat on these critters. So there are various possible explanations.
Well, as I tried to as I really tried to pursue this in my research and in my discussions, because I was sure I had seen a wolf. In any event, how is it that people end up with these hybrid dogs and wolves if there are no wolves in the East?
Well, unfortunately, you can buy them through the newspapers, or you can buy, we find all sorts of things you can buy on eBay even. And hybrids are popular among some sectors, and unfortunately not every state has laws preventing it. So some states have very strict laws and you can't own them, but other states do, and we don't believe they make good pets. They're very risky. It's a cross between a domesticated animal and a wild animal, slightly unpredictable, but it's easy to get your hands on.
Well, it's interesting because now here in Massachusetts, what we have is hysteria over the coyotes. I mean, we have police officers shooting coyotes, and oh my, here we are, hysteria at large. Your reaction to that?
Well, coyotes have been, as David said, have been expanding through the East, and they can be a nuisance, and it's another wildlife species that we need to learn to coexist with. I have a coworker at Defenders whose little dog was attacked by a coyote in Rock Creek Park and survived, luckily, but it is something that people need to take care of.
Well, you'll have to come back and tell us about that because we're out of time, and I'm so sorry. Panel, thank you so much for being here with me today. To our viewing audience, until next time, be well and thanks.